Hey guys, it's Daniel. Today I got to sit down and talk to Zev Eisenberg, who is an iOS developer at Rightpoint. He is a former ASAP employee, like many NMD students, and we got to talk about app development, working at Savant, being a new media student who accidentally reset a server, which is something that apparently you're never supposed to do, which I wouldn't know, but I would kind of assume. But what do I know? I just do video and this podcast. Anyways, enjoy. So, Zev, thank you so much for sitting down to do this interview with me.
My pleasure.
I am very excited to finally get to talk to you because I've heard of you and you seem almost decorated, according to some of the new media faculty. So I can't thank you enough for sitting down for this. And I guess to just jump right in, how did you go from being an iOS dev from the University of Maine?
So the iPhone came out the year that I graduated high school, 2007. And I was way into Apple stuff. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. I think I originally applied to UMaine for engineering. Then by the time I got there, I ended up finding out about the new media major. And that seemed pretty cool, so I switched to that. And did a lot of the intro courses. And I think at that point I wanted to be a filmmaker. I was into editing and doing sort of movie stuff and graphics design things. I read a design book in high school and spent about a year thinking I was going to be a designer. And then within my first year, took the CS 125, which was in Scheme at that point, which was super weird. They were like, your previous programming ability or experience had no bearing on how you did in the class. It was very strange, but I liked it a lot. And
right.
that and some projects, as I started to get involved with ASAP, some sort of programming stuff, it started to like, I can kind of do this. This is fun, and I kind of get it. And it sort of, I had a bunch of false starts trying to learn programming when I was younger. You know, a neighbor who was a programmer would try to teach me, or I'd try to learn from a book, and it was just complicated, and I didn't really know what to do. And then, you know, having an environment like Scheme in that first programming class, which is not like, it's weird. I've talked to other like established programmers about it more recently, and they're like, yeah, it's super weird, but it's this very contained environment. You open up the program, you type stuff, it works, and somebody was telling me what to type and telling me when I was doing it right and doing it wrong. And so for the first time I was like, okay, I can finally like actually program stuff. You know, did some like the intro filmmaking and intro to new media design. So got some exposure to filmmaking, but I think pretty quickly gravitated towards doing the programming stuff more as a primary thing. So that's what I ended up kind of doing. And then we were sort of experimenting with some of the iPhone SDK came out the next year. So the iPhone software developer kit, and I was like, okay, I'm hooked. This thing looks so amazing, and it's such this sort of beautiful gem, and I want to make it do cool stuff. And all the apps that I'd seen were, of course, made by Apple because there were no apps. There was no app store, and they were all so pristine and so perfect, and all the transitions and sort of navigation was so good. And I was really pretty into, like, even though I was working on more programming stuff, I was really into like design and usability, and it just felt so nice, and I really wanted to make stuff. So when the SDK came out, I didn't really, like, I'd done a tiny bit of programming. I didn't really know what programming was still, and I had heard this buzzword, object-oriented programming, and I thought, well, I don't know what that is, but you need that to make iPhone apps, so I'm going to go learn that. So I had a free, like, I had some elective or something, so I took CS 225, Intro to Object-Oriented Programming in Java with Larry Latour, and learned just enough in that class to be like, oh, okay, objects, great, that's a thing. And then after that point, just used iPhone programming in every assignment I could, in every class I could. Built stuff as iPhone apps. Just started, like, after that class, basically was self-teaching in Objective-C. We had a book at ASAP that I used, and started to find tutorials and things. And so I ended up doing my I guess my new media capstone / honors thesis in as an iPad and iPhone app with a partner, Jonathan Simpson, who's another new media student. And we built this thing, and it was like a card game for iPad, and where you would have cards on your phone, and you could drag them like to the edge of the phone, and they would show up on the iPad. You could play a card game, and people would walk by and see us testing it and go like, "Oh, that's cute, but what? Everybody's going to have an iPhone, and somebody's going to have an iPad." This was in like 2010, 2011. Yeah, right. That'll ever happen. So that ha ha ha. I say ha ha ha.
Nice. That's very cool.
Yeah. So I had that app that I'd done with Jonathan, and a couple other things that we had worked on together. By the time senior year rolled around, and I was working at ASAP, and Jeff Ma, who works at Apple, had sent out. He had forwarded an email from some contacts of his at this home automation company called Savant. So they were looking for iOS developers / designers, like basically a developer who could speak designer, and had sent an email to Jeff. They did home automation and like media stuff, so they had contacts with Apple TV, and he worked on the Apple TV team. And he sent an email to Mike because he used to work at ASAP, and Mike Scott sent the email around to ASAPers, and I picked it up and applied. So before I graduated senior year, I ended up with a job at Savant in Cape Cod. And I went and worked there for about 2.5 years, working on like, I realized after I got there how little I knew about programming as a discipline. Like I could scrape stuff together, and I had a pretty good eye for visuals and UI and like user experience. So I was kind of half on the design team doing prototyping and half on the engineering team. And I learned a ton of Objective-C and app development. So I worked there for about 2.5 years. And then at some point they were looking to get some contract work done, and Raise Labs was on their list of potential contractors, Raise Labs in Boston. And so that's how they got on my radar. And then when I was looking to get off the Cape and move to Boston anyway, they were one of the places I went to, and it seemed like a good fit. So I moved to Boston and started working at Raise Labs in 2014. And then they were acquired by Rightpoint in 2017. So I basically kept the same job, but now at Rightpoint.
Nice.
And it's an agency that makes apps and stuff.
Very cool. So can you give me a little bit of background about what Rightpoint does? Like I know in your email you had said it is kind of boring, but just for context's sake.
Rightpoint is an agency that builds software for clients. Rightpoint, prior to the acquisition, was mostly focused around Microsoft related stuff. So a lot of content management systems, something called Sitecore. I don't really understand what that is, but that's what a lot of people do, and that's kind of what they were known for. And they were looking to be able to offer their clients mobile apps, mobile development stuff. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but mobile apps are like a thing. And
I think I've heard of them.
Yeah.
Like once or twice.
So Raise Labs was a fairly well-known mobile agency in Boston and Oakland at the time. And so rather than try to build up a team from scratch, which can take quite a while, it seemed like a good fit to do an acquisition. So Raise Labs, similarly, just building apps for clients. We get to work on a wide range of stuff for all kinds of different clients. It's one of the things I like about consulting is every few months it's a new interesting project.
Oh, that's really cool. That's awesome. That would honestly be like the dream, to work for a studio that gets that kind of work. So it's a variation all the time.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, there's some things I miss about working at Savant, where it's like you have a project or a product rather, and all your time and energy is just keeps going into making this one product better. And if it's a product that you're really passionate about and really can sink your teeth into, that can be really great. And you wouldn't want that to be something that you have to say goodbye to after 6 months.
Yeah.
But I really do like the variety. I think since I'm not working on this one thing all the time, I feel like the product that I and a lot of my coworkers are really building is a company that's great at building apps. So the stuff that we kind of work on and optimize is like, how can we get better and learn from our mistakes and make the next app better than the last one? Mm-hmm. And you don't get that opportunity to start over greenfield at a single product company. So I enjoy that.
For sure. And what do you do kind of specifically there as an iOS developer?
So I write Swift code all day, or I aspire to write Swift code between meetings. Depending on how you look at it. So I work on fairly small teams. I think they're fairly small especially compared to a product company. So a team working with a client would be sort of 2 to 4 developers for iOS, for Android, and for web, depending on which platforms the project requires, plus a designer, maybe 2 for a big project, and a project/product manager. So somebody who not only organizes people's time, but who really is, like in a movie, they'd be the director, like the person who really has the vision for the product and kind of keeps everybody moving in the same direction and making sure everybody knows what they're working on, and also is the main interface to the client and kind of deals with client interactions so that the developers and designers can keep focusing on building stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we plan out the project with the client. We try and get all our cards on the table, figure out exactly what we're trying to build and why. We do a fair amount of strategy. Like, we know mobile and apps and kind of have been in the business for a while. So we can work with clients to figure out, like, do you really need a mobile app? Do you really need it to be, the next Facebook? Or like, should we try and carve out a niche of something that might actually be something that won't cost an arm and a leg to build and will actually be something that's useful to you and your customers?
Yeah. Working with clients is like one of the biggest things that you learn out in the field versus in school, I've found.
Yeah, except if you get a chance to work at ASAP. Yeah. It's all client stuff.
It is. So can you give me a little bit of an overview of the transit app that you built?
Yeah, so I was really lucky to be able to work on this app. This was a couple years ago. It was an app for the Perkins School for the Blind. They secured a grant through google.org, which is like a sort of philanthropy portion of Google. And they were putting money towards sort of accessibility, navigation, transit type stuff. And so they had a pretty open-ended grant to just like build something related to accessibility. And so they came to us basically with that as the pitch, saying, hey, we got to build something. What is possible? What technology is out there? What can we do? What can we work with? And so we did a bunch of usability studies and research and trying to figure out what we could build. I wasn't on the first part of the project, so a lot of this is secondhand. I can actually send you, if you do show notes, I can send you a link to a really cool video by one of our product managers, Chris Hogewerf. He did a neat talk on some of the development of the project. But what we landed at, we tried to do, so the kind of problem that was identified is a lot of blind and visually impaired people use GPS to navigate, and it's like a pretty amazing tool for that community, but it's not quite precise enough to get them to a bus stop. So if they're trying to catch a bus, they got to be standing right at the bus stop, or they just look like another pedestrian and the bus isn't going to see them and isn't going to stop. And so we were trying to solve that kind of last 30 feet problem. Mm-hmm. And we looked into some things around computer vision. Maybe you could, read signs with the phone's camera, and maybe today that would be a little more possible. This was sort of 3-ish years ago, so like 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. And at the time, on-device neural networks and computer vision stuff was a lot less powerful than it is today. So what we ended up coming up with was a much simpler solution. I mean, technologically, there's like not really a whole lot going on here. It's crowdsourced clues for hyper-local information, which is to say, can we describe the area in the few feet, maybe 10, 20, 30 feet around a bus stop in a way that is useful to someone who's blind or visually impaired? So what does that mean? That means describing the area in terms of things that you could feel, things you could detect with a blind cane, or just feeling around, and things that sort of match the mental model that someone who's visually impaired might use when they navigate the world. And this involved a pretty heroic effort by some of our designers, especially a guy named Adam Fasia, who did a lot of the design work and like user studies on this. And we came up with some ideas and tried to test them out. I think there were some things that are somewhat reminiscent of some research that Nick Giudici has been doing at Vemilab, or around, in and around the HCI stuff.
Sounds similar.
Yeah. Where like we had some things with where you'd make a map on the phone and then you could try and feel out the map. And for anyone who's not familiar, there's a technology built into iOS called VoiceOver that's a screen reader. So it reads what's on the screen to you, and it takes some bit of minimal effort for an app developer to make the app able to kind of describe itself in words. But then you can navigate around the app by sliding a cursor around on the screen that you don't have to see, and then it reads what's under the cursor. So you build an app that knows how to work with this. And what we eventually came up with was a system where we figured out what kind of clues would be useful. So, for example, you want to describe the pole that the bus stop sign is on. So maybe it's a wooden pole, maybe it's a concrete pole. We had one entry in there that was a pole with a U-shaped cross-section, but U-shaped doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's not really in a blind person's everyday vocabulary. So we changed it to a square pole open on one side. And that's the kind of thing that you really can only find out through a lot of user testing and iteration.
Yeah.
So we figured out what kind of clues. Yeah, exactly. We figured out what kind of clues would be useful. And then we built a little kind of interface for sighted people primarily. Anybody can enter clues, but we figured for the most part it would be sighted people, where it kind of walks you through entering clues, not as freeform text, but kind of picking from a list of things that would be useful. And it was local to Boston, so we went all around Boston finding like what are all the things that might be on a street near a bus stop. And there's free text entry, but for the most part, we try to guide you to like pick one of the options from the list.
Right.
And then as a blind person is walking down the street and they choose a bus stop, it will read the clues in order. And it's things like there's a tree, then there's a bench, then the sign is on a square pole that's made of concrete. And then if you get to a trash can, you've gotten too far.
Okay.
So it kind of helps them orient themselves. And we had this pretty amazing moment. It's actually in the video of the presentation that Chris gave about the project, where we had a prototype of the app running on a phone, and we have this video of one of the testers using it, and he's scrolling through the app using the VoiceOver screen reader, and the app says the bus stop sign is on a pole, and to the left of the sign there's a driveway. And he kind of stops and goes, "What? I don't get it. What does that mean? How could the driveway be to the left of the sign? That doesn't make any sense." And we were thinking, well, it's right there. I don't get what the problem is. And it took a lot of just sort of talking back and forth to figure out what the problem was. And I think this is pretty typical of any conversation. Like, you can have some mismatch and not realize it for a long time until you realize you're talking about completely different things. What we figured out is that the way we were designing the app and thinking about the bus stop is, imagine you're standing on the sidewalk looking towards the street, and arrayed in front of you from left to right are a series of objects. There's a tree, there's a bench, there's a sign. But a lot of our testers, a lot of the people who are actually going to be using this app, were walking down the sidewalk with the street, let's say, on their left. So the street is always on their left side as they're walking down the sidewalk, and they're encountering these objects on the sidewalk one at a time. They'll encounter a tree, then they'll get to a bench, then they'll get to the sign. So their mental model was front to back or back to front, and ours was side to side. So when the app said the bus stop sign, to the left of the sign, there was a driveway, they thought to the left of the sign was out in the street, and it didn't make sense for there to be a driveway in the street. And once we figured out that sort of mental model switch, everything kind of clicked into place, because then the wizard that guides you through setting up the clues has this presentation from left to right, as you might see it if you were standing there looking at the sign, and then it would rearrange the clues to present them to the user in a front to back fashion. And you can actually switch it straight on your left or straight on your right, and it will reorder the clues. So it was like the app was like it's a kind of cool app. I'm pretty proud of it, but there's not a ton of like exciting technology there. It's just it's lists and databases. But if that user research hadn't gone into it and hadn't figured out like what's the mental model, you couldn't have used it.
Yeah, definitely. It's so clever. Just the whole concept. Definitely not something that I would have put together my first try. And I've encountered that same kind of butting heads with the people who are using something and then the people who are developing it.
Yeah.
And then there's the communication block.
Yeah, and you see it, like anybody who builds software has had this experience. I definitely saw it at ASAP. I saw it a ton at Savant, where we had very opinionated users of our stuff, where no matter how careful you are as a designer, as somebody who uses the thing all the time and really thinks about all the edge cases and like, oh, what if the user gets here? What if they press this? You put it in somebody's hands and they will use it upside down. Or they will look at an icon and says, what is this button? And you say, that's not a button. And they say, it looks like a button. So, you know what? I guess it's a button. You have to get this stuff in people's hands early and often because this stuff is always going to happen.
Yeah. Touching back onto Savant that you just mentioned, can you tell me a little bit about what you did there? I know you said you started there with like kind of minimal background, but you made it in. So what did you end up actually doing there?
So I think I was officially on the payroll of the design team, but I was definitely kind of spanning that divide. I kind of became the guy who you went to if you needed a designer who spoke engineering or an engineer who spoke design. So I was like the pixel guy.
Right.
And the first thing that there were designers, full-time designers when I got there, but there wasn't really like a cohesive design department. There was like, everything was kind of engineering driven. So an engineer or manager would come up with a product idea and then kind of get the designers to make assets and icons for that. So the first thing that I ended up working on there was an energy monitor. So we had this product. It was this big box you'd stick near your distribution panel. That's the thing with all the like breaker switches. And it had these clamps that you put on all the wires coming out of it, and it could measure your energy usage. And so we needed some way to display in an app what your home energy usage was and display it in a way that was like useful and you could work with and like would give you useful information about like, oh, this is using more energy than I thought. Maybe I should make some changes. And so I had never really designed a product before. I had just done, school projects. I'd done my capstone, the card game thing. And so it wasn't quite a product. It was like a feature in an existing app. They had their home automation app. They wanted to add a screen for the energy monitor. So that was my first big project. I did a bunch of designs and went through some iteration. I had this way over-designed idea of like this gauge that had both a linear scale and a logarithmic scale, which in retrospect was a really bad idea. I'm really good at sort of designing myself into a corner where I can tell you all the mathematical reasons why a design makes sense, but then it turns out it's not a good idea. And this was part of why part of my journey towards realizing that though I can speak designer and I have a decent eye for detail, I should not be a full-time designer. And I'm pretty happy with that development. So anyway, I designed this thing working with some engineers and with some of the other designers, and then I ended up building it as well. So it was kind of neat, like being the person who designed the feature and then got to build it. And I made a huge mess of the code. And for any programmers listening, I had this gauge with all these like nested graphs, and I made the whole thing recursive. So like every call to calculate the size of the gauge had to do this massive recursive operation to calculate the size of all the sub slices on the pie chart, and it was kind of a mess. Fortunately, there were some actual engineers there who straightened me out pretty quick. I've never learned something so fast as my first maybe year at Savant, learning more about Objective-C. Like I learned enough to self-teach and kind of get through some classes, but
yeah. So it's a real trial by fire there.
Yeah.
For you, at least.
Yeah.
That's intense.
But it was fun. It was I never, like, the people I was working with were very encouraging and supportive, and like, you know, thinking back on it now, I'm amazed they let me anywhere near the code. But you know, I learned a ton, and we built something.
Yeah.
At the end of it.
Yeah. No, that's super cool. Jumping back in time to young Zev starting out at the University of Maine way back. What was your perception of new media when you first began the major?
So when I came to visit UMaine, when I was looking at schools, I believe I was applying for engineering. I didn't know the difference between computer science and computer engineering at the time. Nobody could really explain it to me in terms that I understood. Like, now I know the difference, I think, but that's only because I know a fair amount about programming that I had no idea about. So I don't know what the right way is to explain it to somebody who doesn't really know what programming is. But so I was applying for one of those. I wasn't sure which one, probably engineering, although I think that would have been a mistake. I would have wanted to apply for computer science. But I think one of the admissions people said, hey, it sounds like you're kind of also into like this artsy, designy stuff. Why don't you go check out new media? And I don't think... Oh, it was when Chadbourne was being renovated. So a lot of the ASAP and new media stuff was like in weird little rooms off the sides of things. So it was like not real ASAP and new media, but I got to go and tour some of the department and see some of the stuff. And I don't think I'd ever seen the Apple 30-inch cinema display in person at that point. And this was like this gargantuan, unbelievably large monitor. And since I was a huge Apple nerd, and still am, I walked into this room and was just overwhelmed by this sight of this unimaginably vast expanse of aluminum, because I was seeing the back of one of these monitors, and I was like, that's it. I'm in. I'm sold. Whatever I got to do. Which is not a good or rational reason to apply for the program. I think there was other stuff that made it sound interesting, and it was like more up my alley in terms of not this rigid kind of engineering thing, but a more like, you know, let me make some stuff. I think ever since going to a Waldorf school for middle school and kind of being encouraged to explore that side of like, you know, it doesn't have to be just the stuff that's in the textbook in exactly the order that it's laid out. Like, let's explore a little bit. Let's try and figure stuff out and make something. So I think that appealed a lot more to me. And I think that's a lot of who ends up in new media is like people who are maybe into some programming or making games or something like that, but aren't really interested in the kind of theoretical academic rigor side of computer science. And also people who are maybe drawing webcomics or making other kinds of art or music, but aren't interested in like a fine art degree, something that's, again, fairly like theoretical and highfalutin. And in new media, you just take different media and smash them together and maybe you make something. And I think that appeals to a lot of people in the major. Yeah,
definitely. And what was the most helpful thing you learned at the University of Maine?
So I learned a decent amount about how and where I'm not good at stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I was always like in especially in high school, I was you know, I hung out with the AP crowd and did the like AP and honors classes, and wasn't so great at humanities, very bad at like picking out metaphors in books, but in general was like, you know, hung out with the smart kids, and I think teachers let me get away with a lot. And even at UMaine, some of that happened. But then when I got to my honors thesis, man, I took a nosedive. I was, let's see, I could write a thesis instead of a capstone, but not a capstone instead of a thesis. There was like some combination. And what I was really interested in was the capstone. This was the card game thing I was working on with Jonathan. And doing research into like, can you take advantage of a person's innate knowledge of how to use something like a deck of cards to make it easier to use a virtual deck of cards on screen? That was kind of our hypothesis we were testing. And that was the part that was interesting to me. So I was definitely going to do the capstone part. Like, oh, I also have to do a thesis thing because of the honors college.
Oh boy.
I approached the thesis the same way I approached a lot of projects, which was sort of sit on it and stew on it for a while and sort of trust that my brain will do most of the work in the background and then sit down and bang it out. And it turns out that
What
that's
a great
not...
approach to a thesis.
Yeah, right. So I don't know what I was thinking other than that I was, 21 and didn't know what was going on.
Yep.
And that didn't work very well. I wrote a thing. It had a bunch of pages. But it was not great. And I didn't meet with my advisors. Like, I think I met with them like once.
My
and
God.
I just didn't didn't know what I was doing.
Wow.
And
that's
impressive, honestly. Yeah, and I presented it, and my thesis committee was like, "What? What happened? Like, we don't know what to do with this." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't really know either." And I remember the day before, or maybe week before, somewhere leading up to the thesis defense, I think I sent an advance copy to one of my advisors, Joe Arsenault, who I don't know, he hangs around Mike Scott and ASAP. I don't really know what his like background or role is, except that he's like super duper smart and perceptive. And I remember a few times talking to him and like try to explain some idea and like, barely pulling together threads of some idea. And he would come back, he would like take it all in and repeat it back to me in the most concise, clear, like, oh my God, you totally get it. I don't even get it. And I'm the one trying to explain it, and he would like totally get it. So I sent him some like advanced copy or early draft, and he wrote back with some really good, honest feedback. And I was like, oh no, this is a premonition. This is not going to go well. And I had this is like the kind of thing where my response to that is like, my brain just feels weird for a few days, and I sort of mope around and don't know what to do until my brain sort of reorganizes itself into, accepting in this new kind of world changing, like, there are some things that I can't just wing. Which was something I would have told anybody that in words, but until my honors thesis, didn't really get at a gut level. So I actually ended up finishing my thesis after starting my job at Savant after theoretical approximate graduation.
Wow.
So I completely rewrote it. It was like I looked up sources online. I don't know. I'm not super proud of it. I think I wrote some stuff. I maybe came up with some ideas. It's definitely, it's not as grandiose as my original plan was, but I think it's a lot more like what it was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that is one approach that you can take to a thesis for all NMD undergrads.
Yeah, I don't
maybe don't take
it.
That approach.
Yeah,
but
I mean, if you want to spend the nights and weekends of your first like 2 months of your job after school, if you're lucky enough to get a job right out of school, also doing homework, I don't recommend it.
Oh my God! Wow. Well, did you have to learn anything else outside of university classes to get where you are now?
Yeah, I think everything, all the things. I learned a bunch in class, and I learned a bunch out of class. I don't necessarily distinguish between them. I guess the things I did in school were not, I never learned things like algorithms in school. Mm-hmm. I never took data structures and algorithms. I kind of wish I had, but I also am where I am and I didn't take it. So maybe it's fine. So I think the thing that I got the most was sort of professors pushing me in directions, or just having me do assignments, things that I wouldn't necessarily have gone out and done, and just kind of trying things out, especially a lot of assignments and things that were just like, you've got max MSP and some assignment, go make something over the weekend, it'll be fine, go do it. And like, that's the environment that I then tried to apply to the thesis. Didn't work out so well, but for the new media kind of stuff, where it's just like, you got to build something, and it doesn't have to be great, it just has to work, like it has to do a thing. That was the most of what I got from school, I think, and the rest is in some ways I think that a lot of the things that I learned outside of school are things I learned in school, in the sense that they weren't requirements, they weren't even close to requirements. Like I took a class on Darwin and like a celebration of the 150th anniversary of the publication of Origin of Species, because it looked like fun. Like maybe I would have done that even if I wasn't in school, like that kind of thing. So I don't, it was a thing that I did while I was also enrolled in the new media program. But it was kind of this other thing I did with a friend for fun. And I had a bunch of stuff like that. I was lucky enough that the honors program took care of more electives than I otherwise would have had taken care of. So I had more free time in my schedule, so I could take stuff that I thought was fun. So I took Calc 3 and a couple of physics classes and just stuff that looked interesting. Some like more design than I might otherwise have had time for if I was more focusing on the computer side of things.
Right.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I don't remember what the question was. So
no, that definitely does. So with everything you know now, would you go back and do anything differently?
Probably not. Again, because I'm pretty happy with where I've ended up so far. Like there's things that I do wish I had done. Like whenever people ask me, what would you be doing if you weren't doing this? It's probably physics, because that's the thing that I found the other thing that I enjoyed the most and was kind of okay at. I sometimes find myself wishing I'd taken either more physics or more computer science classes, but then I think, well, but what would be different? Like I've gotten to where I am without having done that, and so I don't know that I necessarily would have changed it.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's necessary to have a 4-year degree at this point?
I know it's not necessary, because I know people who don't. Who, like, I have coworkers who don't have 4-year degrees, and who are some of our best developers, people who are really good at solving problems, things like that. I don't know the statistics in terms of how many people are getting 4-year degrees, and then balancing out the sort of risk benefit in terms of expected value of a degree. Like if you play it like a lottery ticket, like the expected value of a degree versus the price of the degree.
Yep.
I don't know, what the relationship is there. I know, as somebody who works in a tech company in a field that's not highly academic, that we more or less don't care what's on your resume really beyond your last job or two, if that. It's really all about, like, we got people asking us to make apps, so can we make apps?
Yep.
So, like, I know in a lot of this field, it doesn't really matter as much. I think in related fields like bioengineering, like engineering that's more coming out of an academic background, where computer science field was filled with academics and PhDs and researchers a while ago. Now it's a bunch of people who know how to make apps. That's where like biotech is right now, where people are coming out of, MIT and Harvard and Stanford, doing this high-end research. So those are fields where you're going to need, a master's or higher, I assume. I don't know many people in the fields directly, but it feels like that's where computer stuff was. And now it's like, you just got to be able to type stuff and, loops and conditionals. It's all loops and conditionals.
Exactly. So to get a little personal, What was your darkest point in getting to where you are now?
It was probably the thesis thing, I think.
Yeah.
Like the biggest
I can see
moment
that.
of like shedding the sort of adolescent invincibility, which I still have in heaps and mounds, but it diminished greatly from where I was in the whatever it was the early spring of 2011. That was really like, oh no, what if
Yeah.
what if I can't sort of coast isn't exactly the right word, but just kind of kick back and do whatever seems fun all the time.
On a lighter note, where do you pull inspiration from?
I like to pull in stuff from sort of hobbies and other experiences. In terms of the things that I do in my spare time that are kind of related. Like I work on some apps and code stuff in my spare time, and right now I have 2 apps in the store and one that I'm working on. So the 2 in the store, one is an app called Padiddle, and it's an app that lets you spin your iPad on your finger and draw pictures using the gyroscope. And that was inspired by a tweet from a friend who was a juggler who tweeted, "Hey, I just got an iPad and I've been opening this drawing app." So jugglers like spinning things on their fingers. And
Yep.
he had just gotten this iPad. He opened a drawing app and flipped it over so his finger was touching the screen and was spinning the iPad like a frisbee on his finger and like drawing these cool squiggles. And I tweeted back and said, "Hey, that's fun, but the iPad has a gyroscope. You should use that." And he said, "Well, maybe I will, but somebody should make an app of that." And this was a few months into working at Savant, and I had been working on apps, but had never made an app start to finish and put it in the store. So I thought, oh, this would be fun. And I mocked it up, the drawing mechanism in like an evening, and then spent maybe a month or 2 polishing it up and got it in the App Store. That was right before iOS 7, so then I had to redo the whole interface because, of course, thanks, Johnny Ive. So that was one, just kind of coming out of juggling and the juggling community, which I have some roots in. And then another one was from, there's this cool video on the YouTube channel Smarter Every Day, where he interviewed a guy who can speak backwards. He can hear someone say a word or sentence and then speak, not reading the letters backwards, but as though he were a backwards playing recording. So getting all the phonemes backwards. And so wow. I thought, oh, that's kind of fun. I kind of like sort of collecting party trick kind of skills. I'd love to learn how to do that. And I had an app that did it, that let you record and speak backwards, like play it backwards, but it had just stopped working because of the 64-bit requirement in iOS 11. And I didn't find any others that I really liked. So I thought, oh, I'll make one. That'll be fun. I haven't really done any audio programming. So I spent probably about a month whipping up an app called Peep, which is a palindrome that has to do with sound. So Peep. So that's in the App Store. So if anybody's listening and their podcast player can play things backwards, my name backwards is Grebna Ziaves Zev Eisenberg. I didn't get much farther learning how to speak backwards. I'm starting to get an ear for it, but I haven't worked on it that much. And the one I'm working on right now is a juggling simulator, where you put in juggling notation, which if you know like ballroom dance notation or knitting notation, it's kind of along those lines, a series of numbers, you type them in and you get a juggling pattern out. So I'm working on an app for all of Apple's platforms that does juggling simulation.
Wow.
Again, just kind of out of interests and hobbies. So that's on the sort of personal project side. And my wife and I are always doing goofy, creative-ish projects and weird things. But then at work, a lot of it, like there's like the designers are so good. The designers I get to work with, it's a real joy to get to work with them. There's ones who can draw and are just like drawing cartoons about everything all the time, and ones who are really sweating the details on pixels and fonts and things, and it's great to be able to work with them. Actually, on one project, we had a designer who had a strong print background, and so the typography that he put in the app that we were working on was just beautiful. Lots of really fine attention to detail to font choices, kerning, line spacing, or leading for the nerds out there, like all that stuff. And then trying to build it, we kept running up against like, oh yeah, we could make those monospace numerals if we had the time, but we don't really know how to do it, so we can't do it. And I was getting kind of frustrated with that because I know Apple's really known for like typography and design, and I figured this stuff, I'm pretty sure this is possible on iOS. Just wasn't exactly sure how to do it all. And as I started to dig into it, I realized, well, sure, you can do it all, but it's a giant mess of just smushing together different properties, and like it's as awful as CSS is. It's this like nice consistent system by comparison to what you have to do in iOS with NS attributed string for any iOS developers out there. You know what I'm talking about. And so I was like, that there's got to be a better way. By the end of that project, we had a file that was like maybe over 1,000 lines long, just of configuring different permutations of like, give me this font with this color, with this line spacing, but without the extra tracking between the characters because that's for this other font, and it was just a mess. So I ended up taking some ideas I got during that and building a tool called Banmo, which is an open source Objective-C and then later Swift tool for doing iOS typography that we've been using a lot at Raise Labs and Rightpoint since then. So it really just kind of reading a lot and sort of talking with a lot of people in the industry doing other interesting things and seeing what they're making so that when the right problem walks in front of me, I can go, aha, there's something I can sink my teeth into, something that not a lot of other people have a ton of expertise in, or even the ones who do, it's like it's still pretty esoteric and there's not an easy way to do it. So I had the pretty good luck with that one, just sort of picking the right thing that a lot of other people had a need for, combining it with a little bit of expertise from, reading that design book in high school and thinking I was a designer for a year and kind of following. That year I did all my homework, like vocab quizzes and history tests and things in Adobe InDesign because I was that kid.
Okay, well, I guess we can finally get to that story about Jacob Landry that I definitely need to hear because I love stories about old ASAP and what all the shindigs and happenings behind the scenes were back there.
So I don't remember. I'm going to get some of the timeline a little bit wrong, but the first thing that I built that could be considered software in terms of like, it was code that I typed and then people used it for stuff was the user account creation system for incoming new media students to get accounts on the file server so that they could, they got something like a gig of space. It's kind of like pre-Dropbox. Like I think Dropbox was just coming out at the time. So it was pretty typical for like a university to have a file server that students could throw stuff up on and then link to it for class or just have some space that was off their own computer. So it was kind of a backup. Right. And when I started, there was a system in place. And so it was this web form. So I had used it once. Like you sign in and you get some space on the server. And then when I was working at ASAP, we needed to move some servers down the hall because the renovations to the building had been done. So we moved the little goofy server rack plugged into its 10100 Linksys router thing, which was ridiculous, out of Stillwater Lab down the hall into the server room. And as we were doing that, we like came in and did it late at night so we wouldn't disturb, it wouldn't have downtime and stuff. And then I noticed that I think it was like the 10.4 to 10.5 macOS updater. And I was like, oh, I'll just update it because, it's nice to have stuff be up to date. Turns out that's not a thing you should do on a server. And I didn't know that. I had spent, like, at the point when I was a freshman, I was already, like, the tech support guy for my entire town, growing up and was, like, pretty okay at fixing people's computers, but servers are a different thing, and I did not know that. So I ran software update and broke a bunch of stuff. And one of the things that I broke was this account creation system.
Oh.
And I kind of got the feeling that this is like a thing that happens every once in a while, and maybe it's not even necessarily a bad thing because it means it gets rebuilt every couple of years, because I'm pretty sure the one I built is not in use anymore. I think somebody rebuilt it again. But it was this weird, like, partly NMD 102 final project or something like that, partly ASAP assignment, sort of a Mike Scott extravaganza, do this thing through class / through work, whatever, to replace this system. So the system was a set of PHP scripts where you go to a web page and you fill in a name and password, and then it would enter those in a MySQL database, but then also write out instructions to a thing I learned about on this project called a FIFO file, which is a first in, first out. Like any text you write into the file just gets sent on to some other script. So there was a shell script running in LaunchD. I'm not sure how technical your listeners are, but this is getting in there. I had the distinct pleasure of working with this guy at ASAP named Carl. I don't know if it's Semic or Semich. He was probably a senior when I was a freshman, and he was a botany major and our like most amazing, prolific programmer, hacker, like lead server guy. I got to watch him like fight a hacker who was hacking into one of the new media department servers, and like I'm going in, I'm gonna get the logs. Oh, he left his password in plain text. Like, let's follow this guy. It was amazing. Anyway, so he helped me figure out how to write a shell script that interacted with a thing that's called like slap config, that's for interacting with LDAP, which is the system that a Mac or Unix server uses to manage user accounts, and got it running through this thing called LaunchD, which is like cron. It's for running scripts periodically on a machine. Like, I got way in over my head on like from web development down to databases, down to server admin on this project. It took like a year this was like my main thing I was doing for my sort of freshman into sophomore year. But I got the thing built with some help from some people at ASAP, and one of those was Jacob Landry, who had done a lot of JavaScript and PHP and was helping me a lot. He's the person, I believe, if I'm remembering right, who taught me about object-oriented programming. Like, I didn't really get it, and I asked him for help. I was trying to build a snake clone in processing, and I was like, how do I make the squares do the thing? And he was like, oh, you should use objects, and my brain exploded. It was the most amazing thing. Like, oh, I can do so much stuff. It was very cool. So anyway, we had gotten this system kind of limping along. It pretty much worked. You could go to the page, type in some stuff, and then do an email confirmation deal, and then you could go in the Finder and go connect to server, put in the new media server address, and sign in with your username and password, and get a file share mount on your computer and put files on it. And it was beautiful. And we thought it was good enough to bring it into one of the incoming freshman classes. I was a sophomore. We brought it to the like Mike's NMD 102 class and said, hey, new bright-eyed, bushy-tailed students, here's this file server thing. You can use it to like put your files and submit assignments. Please note that this is beta, and stuff might not work. So like, maybe don't put your only copy of files on here. But as anybody who has ever lost data will tell you, you don't really appreciate backup religion until you have lost files. So like, and not just a little bit of backup. Like, I'm talking 3-2-1 backup. You have 3 different backups on 2 different media, one of which is offsite. Like, that's me now after things. So, but we told them this, and they started using it, and we got some bug reports, and they were it was working okay. And then Jacob Landry and I were working on it. I didn't know JavaScript, and I basically made it through this project without ever learning any JavaScript, which I'm very thankful for. It served me well in my later career. And so we were working on the site, and Mike had asked for some admin features, things like bulk selecting users on the admin side and deleting them or renaming or whatever for class admin stuff. So we were building this feature where you could check a bunch of checkboxes, one next to each user, and then apply bulk actions to them. And Jacob was writing the JavaScript, and then he would save onto the server, and then I would hit reload and load it up in the browser on my side and test it. And we had a logging thing turned on, so it would print out all the users that it had deleted. We were testing bulk delete. And at one point, he said, okay, test it. And I reloaded the page, and it said, users deleted, and then listed out every single user in the department. And that was it. It was like in fourth Harry Potter where they kill Cedric, and it's like very, very sudden. They were just gone.
And they were everyone.
And all the first year new media students no longer had their files. And because they were first year new media students, they also did not have backup religion. So there were a few people who had been working on their only copy of their files on that server.
No.
So that, and this was like, late on a Friday night at ASAP, me and Jacob working on this. And so that was a fun email to write to Mike. Hey Mike, we might
quick update.
have made one small mistake. He was chill about it, which I'm very grateful for. Yeah, but that was formative. Not darkest moment, because I mostly laugh about it now, but you learn a lot of lessons when you realize what kind of power you have at your fingertips when you're programming, because you're just typing stuff. It's the same thing you do when you're talking to your friends or playing a game, and then suddenly 100 students' work that they've each spent dozens or maybe hundreds of hours on, their vector self-portraits, their what was the 10-second countdown videos, their NMD 102 weird Mike Scott projects are just gone instantly. So yeah, that was formative, definitely.
RIP to all the portfolios that lost such quality work.
Yeah, I should get in touch with Jacob, and I'd love to hear his memory of that.
I'll shoot him a message and see if I can get a quote for the blog post.
Yeah.
In response.
Totally.
In response. The next thing that I hope to get from you is an online resource that you can recommend.
Go and find and read and watch everything that Brett Victor has ever made. I believe that's BRET, 1T Victor. His Twitter is Worry Dream. He does this. It's very new media. It's also very theory of computer science. His kind of whole thing is what if programming weren't this esoteric text thing that was kind of came out of Bell Labs and a bunch of dude bros with neck beards and all the women that history has so kindly erased. Thanks, history. So what if programming were a different thing? What if we could take the types of problems that we're currently solving with typing text in a text file and kind of look at it a little bit differently? And so his stuff is it's very interesting, interactive programming. If you played with Swift Playgrounds in Xcode, Swift Playgrounds borrow a lot from some of Brett Victor's work. Things like, what if you could see the output of your program as some kind of visualization, and as you change variables, you could see the output immediately? Like if you have a character in a game that's jumping, you see every frame of that jump. And so if you know about sort of keyframes and timing, you can tell what the jump is looking like. And then as you change variables, you can see that timing change. Or as you grab the character and drag it around, you can see the code change. It's this very direct relationship. He has some really cool animation building tools, sort of motion graphics animation things, where you're not sort of authoring an animation so much as performing it. It's like what if After Effects were a puppeteering tool kind of things. It's super interesting, super forward looking, really breaking the mold of programming is this thing, and sort of motion graphics, digital art is this other thing, and each of them is done in these very prescriptive ways. It's super fascinating. So I highly recommend you check out Brett Victor's stuff.
Okay, definitely. And what is one piece of advice you would give to new media students who are interested in pursuing a job similar to yours?
So I used to tell people what I had done, which is find something that you're passionate about and just kind of do that. Now what I tell them is to avoid the survivorship bias. The survivorship bias is this thing that I don't know if this is when it was identified, but the sort of classic urban legend, I believe it's true, but it might as well be an urban legend, is that planes were coming back from, I think it was World War II, with holes in them from guns. And they wanted to add armor to the planes, but you can't just armor the whole plane because then it's too heavy. And the more armor you add, the more fuel you use up. So it's kind of a balancing act. And so they went to statisticians and they said, where can we armor the planes? Where can we put armor, the least armor that we need to do the most good in terms of protecting these planes and helping them survive their missions and come back alive? And the sort of initial approach, the naive approach, was look at the planes that have come back and find where the bullet holes are and put armor where the bullet holes are. But it turns out that that is not necessarily the best place to put the armor, because those are the planes that survived. Those are the ones that took all those bullet holes. They had all those holes in their wings and missing propellers and whatever, and still made it back. Those aren't the ones you need to worry about. The ones you need to worry about are the ones that are getting shot down and aren't making it back. So what does this have to do with career in new media or app development? We put a lot of focus in our society on successful people and, to the extreme, like celebrities and sort of very out there politicians. And we always ask, there's books, 7 or whatever habits of highly successful people or effective people, whatever. Obviously, I haven't read it, but it is just asking the people who succeeded what they do, what their secret is not necessarily asking the right question. What you need to ask is what are all the people doing? Because you often hear this story of someone who lives to 105 or something, and they ask them what their secret is, and it seems like it's invariably cigars and brandy. And maybe that is the secret to longevity, but you've got to look at all the people who are using cigars and brandy and see what the sort of statistical outcome is, where our brains seem to be sort of geared towards looking at these success stories and following successful people and then ascribing too much significance to whatever little thing it is that they do. So I think that's the most the sort of life advice / career advice that I like to give people coming out of college is beware the survivorship bias. Don't just listen to interviews of people who are in a good place right now, because there must be someone else who did, or there often is someone else who did exactly the same things, or was better in class or made a cooler project or whatever. And there's so many other factors: luck, socioeconomic status, health. Whether you're socially comfortable with taking an interview or going up to somebody. Like, there's so many other factors that are also in play. So,
no, that's great. That's super insightful. Honestly, I really appreciate that. Where can people find you and follow you online and see what Rightpoint does?
So Rightpoint's at rightpoint.com. We have I think there's a sizzle reel up on the website at the moment with a cool kind of quick view of a bunch of projects we've worked on, I believe, including the Blind Ways project. You'll see somebody using a phone, not looking at the screen and saying like, oh, that's pretty neat. So that's at rightpoint.com. And I'm on many of the social medias as at Zev Eisenberg, primarily Twitter, begrudgingly. RIP@.net.
Okay, cool. So Zev, thank you again so much for sitting down and doing this with me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's kind of it. I still haven't figured out a way to end the podcast.